In 1852 Virginia, a plantation owner dismissed his wife's warnings about his brother's behavior, called her concerns hysteria, defended family loyalty above her comfort. 9 months later, the child was born bearing a birthmark that revealed which brother had truly fathered him, a truth written on innocent skin that destroyed everything. Make sure you watch till the end. Before we dive into the story, if you've ever felt the frustration of speaking truth and being dismissed, of knowing something was wrong, but having no one believe you, then this story will resonate deeply. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel, because these historical accounts remind us that silenced voices eventually find ways to be heard. Also, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let's continue with the story. The April morning in 1852 brought William Hartwell home to his Virginia plantation with Caroline beside him in the carriage, his new bride still adjusting to the weight of her wedding ring and the reality of leaving Charleston society behind. Hartwell Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of fertile Virginia Piedmont, the main house rising white and columned above gardens that had been tended for 3 generations, surrounded by fields worked by over 200 enslaved people whose labor sustained the family's wealth and position. Caroline watched the house grow larger through the carriage window, her gloved hands folded tight in her lap to keep them from trembling. She was 22 years old, educated at the finest Charleston academies, raised for exactly this kind of advantageous marriage to plantation wealth. Yet nothing in her careful upbringing had quite prepared her for the isolation of becoming mistress to an estate this remote from the social circles she had known. William pressed her hand with the easy confidence of a man who had courted and won exactly what he wanted. He was 33, handsome in the strong-featured way that marked generations of Hartwell men, his dark hair and commanding presence making him a prize in any social setting. He had appeared at a Charleston ball in January, danced with Caroline twice, called on her family the next morning, and proposed within 8 weeks with the certainty of someone accustomed to having his desires met promptly. The carriage halted before the front steps, and a figure emerged from the house with such sudden energy that Caroline startled slightly. Edward Hartwell moved with the quick enthusiasm of a younger brother, eager to please, bounding down the steps to open the carriage door himself before the driver could dismount. He was perhaps 30 years old, sharing William's dark coloring and strong build, but carrying himself with less weight of responsibility, his smile quick and his manner immediately familiar in ways that made Caroline uncertain whether to feel welcomed or overwhelmed. Brother, and here she is at last, the beautiful bride who has made you the most enviable man in Virginia. Edward's hands came to Caroline's waist as he helped her down from the carriage, his grip lingering a beat longer than strictly necessary, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to catalog every detail of her face and figure. The moment stretched just slightly past comfort before he released her and stepped back, still smiling. William clapped his brother's shoulder with obvious deep affection, the 2 men falling into the easy physical camaraderie of siblings who have never been separated for long. Caroline, Edward has been managing the entire plantation in my absence these past months. I could not run this place without him, truly. He has given up any prospects of his own estate to remain here and make Hartwell what it is. You give me far too much credit, Edward said, but his gaze had returned to Caroline's face, studying her with that same focused attention that made her want to adjust her bonnet or smooth her skirts, anything to break the weight of his scrutiny. I simply try to make myself useful to family, which is where any man's first loyalty must lie. The brothers walked ahead into the house with arms around each other's shoulders, their movements synchronized in the way of people who have lived in close quarters their entire lives, finishing each other's sentences and laughing at private references Caroline could not hope to understand. She followed several steps behind, watching how they moved as a unit, how the household staff deferred to both men with equal measures of respect, how the house itself seemed built around their shared occupancy rather than designed for a new bride to claim as her domain. Those first weeks established patterns that would govern Caroline's life at Hartwell Plantation. The house ran with practiced efficiency under the supervision of elderly servants who had served the family for decades, who knew William's preferences and Edward's habits far better than they could ever know hers, who deferred to her out of duty but looked to the brothers for actual direction. She learned to navigate social obligations among neighboring plantation families, mastered the expected routines of overseeing household management, settled into the rhythms of a life quite different from the one she had imagined during her Charleston courtship. William was attentive in the early weeks of marriage, but increasingly absent as business demanded his attention, riding out each morning to inspect fields and operations, traveling to Richmond every few weeks to manage financial affairs and meet with factors who sold their tobacco crop. His absences could stretch to a week or more, leaving Caroline alone in the big house with servants who were polite but distant, and with Edward, who was neither. Edward's presence became the constant in her new life. He appeared at breakfast each morning to discuss the day's work with William, his knowledge of every detail of plantation operations making him indispensable to his brother's management. He joined them for dinner most evenings, entertaining with stories from his day and observations that made William laugh with genuine delight at his brother's wit. He offered to show Caroline aspects of the plantation she might find interesting: the greenhouse with its cultivated roses, the stables where fine horses were bred and trained, the far boundaries of the property where forests gave way to mountain views. His attention felt flattering at first, the devotion of a brother eager to make his new sister feel welcomed into the family circle. But gradually, in ways Caroline struggled to articulate even to herself, something about Edward's behavior began troubling her in ways she could not quite name or dismiss as imagination. She noticed how his eyes followed her movements when they were in the same room, how he always seemed to know where she was in the house, appearing in the library when she went to read in the afternoon, materializing in the garden when she took her morning walks, joining her in the drawing room when she sat with embroidery in the evening. His compliments, which had been general and proper at first, grew increasingly personal and specific, moving from polite remarks about her dress to observations about the particular shade of her eyes in certain light, the musical quality of her laugh, the graceful way she moved through a room or turned her head. When William was present, Edward's behavior remained impeccably proper, the devoted younger brother showing appropriate deference and respect. But when they were alone, even with servants nearby, something shifted in Edward's manner that Caroline felt, but could not quite define. A familiarity that seemed to presume intimacy not yet earned, a way of standing slightly too close or letting his hand rest slightly too long when helping her with a door or offering his arm. She told herself repeatedly that she was imagining things, that Charleston Reserve was simply different from Virginia hospitality, that Edward was merely being kind and welcoming in his particular way. He was William's beloved brother, his most trusted companion, the man who had sacrificed his own prospects to remain at Hartwell and make it prosperous. Surely she was misreading innocent kindness as something troubling because she was still adjusting to her new life and feeling vulnerable in unfamiliar surroundings. By late May, William's business trips to Richmond had grown longer and more frequent, sometimes keeping him away for 10 days at a stretch, while tobacco markets demanded his attention and financial negotiations required his presence. Caroline found herself increasingly alone in the vast house with only servants for company, and Edward, who seemed to arrange his schedule to ensure he was never far from wherever she happened to be. The discomfort she had tried to dismiss as imagination crystallized into something undeniable. One humid afternoon in June, Caroline had retreated to the library seeking refuge from the heat, settling into a chair by the window with a book of poetry she had brought from Charleston. She had been reading perhaps 20 minutes when Edward appeared in the doorway. No knock or announcement preceding his entrance, his presence suddenly filling the quiet room. "I thought I might find you here," he said, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. "William tells me you are quite devoted to literature. I confess I have never had much patience for poetry myself, but I admire those who find beauty in carefully arranged words." He crossed the room to stand near her chair, close enough that Caroline had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath, though it was barely past noon. His hand came to rest on the back of her chair, his fingers mere inches from her shoulder, his body angled in a way that felt deliberately encroaching on her space. "You seem lonely here," Edward continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. "Isolated from your Charleston friends, left alone so often, while William tends to business. That must be difficult for a young bride, to discover that marriage to a plantation owner means long stretches of solitude." Caroline stood abruptly, moving away from the chair and toward the door, her heart beating too fast in her chest. "I am adjusting quite well, thank you, and I should go see about arrangements for dinner." Edward moved to block her path, not overtly threatening, but positioned in a way that made clear she could not leave without pushing past him. His expression had lost all pretense of brotherly concern, something hungry and calculating showing through the mask he wore when others were present. "Caroline," he said, and the use of her given name without proper address felt like a transgression. "I have watched you these past weeks, seen how you try to make yourself at home here, how you smile and play the role William expects. But I see more than he does. I see a woman who married for security and position, who finds herself trapped in a life smaller and lonelier than she imagined. I could offer you something different: companionship during William's absences, understanding of what you truly need." The words hung between them, their meaning unmistakable, despite being wrapped in language that allowed for plausible deniability if she chose to pretend she had misunderstood. Caroline's throat went dry, her hands clenching at her sides as she struggled to find words adequate to the situation. "You mistake yourself entirely," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am quite content in my marriage, and have no need of any companionship beyond what my husband provides. Please, step aside." Edward studied her face for a long moment, then smiled in a way that held no warmth whatsoever. "Of course, forgive me if I have somehow given offense." He moved aside with exaggerated courtesy, gesturing toward the door with a small, mocking bow. "But Caroline, before you go, consider this carefully. William and I are closer than you can possibly understand. We have never kept secrets from each other, never chosen any loyalty above our bond as brothers. If you were to speak to him about some imagined impropriety on my part, whose word do you think he would believe? His wife of 2 months, or the brother who has stood beside him his entire life?" The threat was delivered with such casual certainty that it took Caroline's breath away. She fled the library without responding, her skirts catching on the doorframe in her haste to escape. She went to her bedroom and locked the door, sitting on the edge of her bed with shaking hands, trying to process what had just occurred and what Edward's words had revealed about her situation. That evening at dinner, Edward was all gracious charm, entertaining William with stories from the day's plantation management, asking Caroline solicitous questions about her comfort and whether she needed anything to make her feel more at home. William noticed nothing amiss, laughing at his brother's jokes, and occasionally reaching over to pat Caroline's hand with absent affection while continuing his conversation with Edward about crop yields and market prices. Caroline picked at her food and said little, watching the brothers interact with their easy camaraderie, understanding for the first time how completely she was outnumbered in this house, how thoroughly Edward had positioned himself as indispensable, while she remained an outsider, still finding her footing. When she caught Edward's eye across the table, he smiled at her with perfect brotherly warmth, and she knew he was demonstrating exactly how well he could perform innocence, how impossible it would be to convince William that anything inappropriate had occurred. That night, lying beside her sleeping husband, Caroline stared at the ceiling and tried to decide what to do. She was 22 years old, married less than 3 months, living in an isolated plantation house with a man who had made his intentions clear, and his immunity from consequences even clearer. She had no allies here, no friends close enough to confide in, no family within easy reach who could offer refuge or advice. The realization settled over her like a weight pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe in the humid Virginia night. She was trapped, and Edward knew it, and there was nothing she could do but pray that William would somehow notice what was happening under his own roof, though every interaction between the brothers made clear just how unlikely that hope truly was. William left for Richmond again in early July, planning to be gone nearly 2 weeks while he negotiated contracts with tobacco merchants and attended to banking matters that required his personal signature. Caroline watched his departure from the upstairs window, her stomach tight with dread at the thought of 14 days alone with Edward and no buffer between them. She tried to protect herself through avoidance, staying in her rooms for much of each day, claiming headaches and fatigue from the summer heat. But the house was only so large, and Edward seemed to possess an uncanny ability to know when she ventured out. Peering in hallways she thought empty, materializing in rooms she believed unoccupied, always with some plausible excuse for his presence that made her feel foolish for seeing menace in ordinary household movements. On the 5th day of William's absence, Caroline went to the greenhouse after breakfast, seeking refuge among the roses that had been her one genuine pleasure in her new home. She spent an hour there, cutting blooms for the dining room and trying to lose herself in the simple peace of tending plants, before Edward's voice behind her shattered the illusion of safety. "You have been avoiding me," he said, standing in the greenhouse doorway with his body blocking the only exit. "That seems unkind, when I have tried so hard to make you feel welcomed here." Caroline straightened, keeping the cutting shears in her hand, though she knew they offered no real protection. "I have been unwell. The heat has been difficult." Edward stepped inside and closed the door. The greenhouse was suddenly suffocating, the humid air pressing down like a weight, the glass walls transforming it from sanctuary to trap. He moved toward her with deliberate slowness, and Caroline backed away until the potting bench stopped her retreat. "You misunderstood my intentions before," Edward said, his voice reasonable and gentle in a way that made her skin crawl. "I only meant to offer friendship, companionship during William's frequent absences, but your reaction made clear that you attribute darker meanings to innocent gestures. That disappoints me, Caroline. It truly does." He reached past her to finger one of the roses she had cut, his arm brushing her shoulder, his face close enough that she could feel his breath. But perhaps I have been too subtle, too careful of your delicate sensibilities. Let me speak plainly now, so there can be no further misunderstanding between us. What he said next stripped away any remaining pretense of brotherly concern. He spoke of having wanted her from the moment William first mentioned his Charleston courtship, of having resented his brother's claim to something Edward believed should have been shared between them, as everything else had always been shared. He described watching her these past months with growing obsession, learning her habits and preferences, planning how he might engineer moments alone with her. His words were simultaneously a confession and a threat, laying out exactly how thoroughly he had studied her vulnerabilities and positioned himself to exploit them. Caroline tried to push past him, and Edward caught her wrist, not violently, but with enough force to stop her movement. William will never believe you if you speak of this. He will think you hysterical, or worse, that you are fabricating accusations to excuse your own inappropriate feelings. I am his brother, his closest friend, the man who has sacrificed everything to stand beside him. You are the outsider here, the Charleston bride, who has never quite fit into Virginia life. Who do you imagine he will choose? He released her wrist and stepped back, his expression shifting instantly to one of mild concern. You look quite pale. Perhaps you should return to the house and rest. This heat is dangerous for those unaccustomed to Virginia summers. Caroline fled the greenhouse with Edward's quiet laughter following her across the garden. She went straight to her room and sat at her writing desk with shaking hands, trying to compose a letter to her mother in Charleston that might somehow convey what was happening without stating it directly enough to cause scandal. But every sentence she attempted seemed either too vague to prompt action or too explicit to send, without destroying her reputation and her marriage. She burned the half-written attempts in her fireplace and locked the letterbox away. Edward had been right about one thing. She was trapped here with no allies and no escape, and speaking the truth would only make everything worse. All she could do was survive until William returned, and pray that Edward would content himself with psychological torment rather than pushing beyond words into action. But when William's letter arrived the next morning, extending his Richmond stay by another week due to complications with his business negotiations, Caroline understood with sinking certainty that Edward had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, and that her time had run out. Edward came to her room 3 nights later, after the household had settled into sleep and the servants had retreated to their quarters. Caroline heard the door handle turn despite the lock she had engaged, heard the quiet click of a key in the mechanism, and understood with cold horror that Edward possessed keys to every room in a house he had managed for years before she arrived. She sat up in bed as he entered, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy. "Get out. Leave now, or I will scream loud enough to wake the entire household." Edward closed the door softly behind him and pocketed the key. And tell them what? That the master's brother came to check on his sister's well-being after hearing sounds of distress? That he found her in a state of hysteria, making wild accusations against the man who has only shown her kindness? He moved toward the bed with calm certainty. The servants are loyal to this family, Caroline, to the Hartwell name, not to a Charleston bride who has been here mere months. What happened next, Caroline would remember in fragments, disconnected pieces her mind tried desperately to separate from the whole. Edward's hands pulling away bedclothes, she clutched for protection, the weight of him crushing the air from her lungs, her own voice, muffled and pleading, ignored as thoroughly as her earlier warnings had been ignored. The methodical way he hurt her, taking his time, as though demonstrating his complete control over her body and her powerlessness to stop him. When it was finished, Edward straightened his clothing with casual efficiency and looked down at her with something that might have been satisfaction or contempt. "You will say nothing about this. William would never forgive you for accusing me, and you would find yourself sent back to Charleston in disgrace, your marriage annulled on grounds of insanity or moral deficiency. I have made sure there are witnesses to your unstable behavior these past weeks, servants who have noted your moods and your isolation, your rejection of normal social interactions." He left as quietly as he had come, locking the door from the outside so she could not follow or escape. Caroline lay motionless for hours after, staring at the ceiling while her body ached, and her mind tried to process what could not be processed. When dawn came, she rose and washed herself with cold water from the basin, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, though no amount of washing could remove the violation or restore what had been taken. William returned from Richmond 2 days later, cheerful and full of news about successful negotiations that would ensure another prosperous year for the plantation. He found Caroline pale and quiet, attributing her mood to the summer heat and women's delicate constitutions. Edward greeted his brother with warm enthusiasm, their reunion marked by the easy affection that had always characterized their relationship, no shadow of guilt troubling Edward's performance of devoted brotherhood. At dinner that evening, Caroline sat silent while the brothers talked, watching them laugh together and share private jokes, seeing how completely William trusted the man sitting across from him. She tried once more, choosing her words carefully, suggesting in the most indirect terms possible that Edward's attention toward her had become uncomfortable, that perhaps it would be better if Edward took rooms elsewhere on the property. William's response was immediate and angry. "I am tired of these implications, Caroline. Edward has been nothing but generous and welcoming to you, and you repay him with baseless suspicions and attempts to drive him from his own home. Perhaps your mother was right to worry about your nervous disposition. This constant agitation over nothing suggests you need rest, and perhaps a physician's care." Edward sat quietly through this rebuke, his expression one of hurt bewilderment, the perfect picture of a wounded innocent defending himself against inexplicable accusations. When William finished his angry speech, Edward reached across the table to pat Caroline's hand with gentle sympathy. "Forgive you completely," he said, his voice full of compassion, while his eyes held nothing but cold triumph. "I understand that adjustment to plantation life can be overwhelming for someone of delicate sensibilities. Please do not distress yourself further over these misunderstandings." Caroline pulled her hand away and excused herself from the table. In her room, she sat at her writing desk and stared at blank paper, knowing there were no words that could save her now. By late August, Caroline's monthly courses failed to arrive. She waited a week, then 2, praying this was merely the result of stress and trauma, rather than the consequence she feared most. When a 3rd week passed with no relief, she understood with sinking certainty that she was carrying a child conceived through violence rather than love. The timing created its own particular horror. William had been home briefly in mid-July, and their marital relations had continued during those few days before he departed again for business. The child could plausibly be his, the dates ambiguous enough to make Caroline's pregnancy appear the natural result of a young marriage. But Caroline knew the truth with the kind of certainty that lives in a woman's body, knew exactly when conception had occurred and whose violence had created the life growing inside her. She watched Edward across the dinner table that evening and saw him calculating the same timeline, his eyes moving from her face to her hands, pressed protectively against her still flat stomach. The smile that crossed his features made her feel sick. He knew what she had not yet told William, and the knowledge gave him another weapon to wield against her. William noticed her pallor and the way she barely touched her food. "Caroline, you really must eat. This heat has been affecting your health for weeks now. Perhaps we should send for a physician." "That might be wise," Edward interjected smoothly. "Though I wonder if the issue is not heat, but something more common to newlywed wives. Caroline, forgive my indelicacy, but have you considered that you might be with child?" The directness of the question in mixed company would normally have been shocking, but Edward delivered it with such concern and propriety that William simply looked startled and then hopeful. "Caroline, is it possible?" She had no choice but to confirm what her body had already revealed. "I believe so. It is still early, but the signs are there." William's joy was immediate and uncomplicated, his face lighting with pleasure as he came around the table to embrace her. "This is wonderful news. An heir for Hartwell, arriving next spring. Edward, we must celebrate this properly." Edward raised his glass with every appearance of brotherly happiness. "To the future of Hartwell. May the child be healthy and strong, bearing all the finest Hartwell family traits." The words seemed innocent to William, but Caroline heard the threat beneath them. The Hartwell birthmark passed, through generations with distinctive patterns, slightly different in each man who bore it. If the child carried that mark, questions might arise about which brother's pattern it most resembled. Edward was gambling that the truth would remain hidden in ambiguous timing. Or perhaps he simply did not care, content in the knowledge that Caroline could never speak about what he had done without destroying herself. The pregnancy progressed through autumn, with Caroline growing larger and more trapped with each passing week. William hovered attentively, full of plans for nurseries and discussions of names, speaking constantly of his son and heir. Edward maintained perfect propriety in William's presence, but found moments when they were alone to make pointed comments about family resemblances, about the famous Hartwell birthmark, about how everyone would watch to see which branch of the family tree the child most favored. "I do hope," he said once in passing, pausing beside her chair in the drawing room while William was out inspecting fields, "that the child inherits the Hartwell features clearly. It would be such a shame if there were any doubt about legitimate lineage, though I suppose these things have ways of revealing themselves, do they not?" Caroline said nothing, her hands clenched in her lap as Edward moved on. The psychological torture was methodical and relentless, designed to keep her constantly aware of the threat hanging over her. The possibility that her child would be born bearing evidence of Edward's violation written permanently on its skin. She tried to find comfort in prayer, in needlework, in preparing the nursery that William insisted on having ready months in advance. But nothing could quiet the terror that grew alongside the pregnancy, the knowledge that in spring, when the child arrived, everything might be revealed or forever concealed, depending on what marks nature chose to write on innocent flesh. Winter came early that year, frost covering the Virginia Piedmont by late November and snow falling in December. Caroline grew heavy and slow, confined mostly to the house by both weather and her condition. Edward was always present, always watching, his eyes following her movements with an attention that felt like ownership. William noticed nothing beyond his wife's increasing discomfort and his own excitement about impending fatherhood, blind to the undercurrents that Caroline could feel in every room of the house. By February, as her time drew near, Caroline had stopped sleeping through the night, lying awake imagining every possible outcome of the birth, every way the truth might reveal itself or remain hidden, every consequence that might follow, regardless of what the child's appearance showed. She was trapped in a nightmare of Edward's making, waiting for spring to deliver either salvation or damnation, with no power to influence which it would be. The Hartwell birthmark had marked every male in the family for as far back as records traced, a port wine stain on the left shoulder blade that appeared within hours of birth and remained throughout life. Caroline had seen William's mark countless times, a distinctive shape roughly resembling a bird in flight, dark red against his pale skin. She had never seen Edward's bare back, but William had mentioned once that his brother bore the same family trait, though in a slightly different pattern, more irregular and spreading wider across the shoulder. As March arrived and Caroline's labor approached, Edward's comments about the birthmark grew more frequent and more pointed. He would appear in doorways while she rested, speaking casually about family history and genetic inheritance, about how his grandfather could identify which son had fathered which grandchild, simply by examining the exact shape and placement of their marks. "It is quite remarkable," Edward said one afternoon, standing in the doorway of the nursery where Caroline sat folding tiny garments. "How precisely these things pass from father to son, not just the mark itself, but its specific configuration. William's resembles our father's almost exactly. Mine takes after our uncle's line, broader and more diffused. I wonder which pattern your child will bear, if any. Though, of course, it would have to be William's. What else could it possibly be?" The words were delivered with perfect innocence, but Caroline's hands shook so badly she had to set down the small gown she was holding. Edward smiled and withdrew, leaving her alone with her terror. William seemed oblivious to these exchanges, focused entirely on practical preparations and his excitement about becoming a father. He had sent to Richmond for the finest physician available, unwilling to trust his heir's birth to a simple country midwife. Dr. Harrison arrived a week before Caroline's due date, a stern man in his 60s who had delivered half the plantation aristocracy in Virginia and carried himself with the authority of his position. The labor began on a warm evening in late March, spring arriving early to the Virginia Piedmont, with dogwoods blooming white against green hills. Caroline's waters broke during dinner, sending William into a panic of activity, shouting for servants and rushing Caroline upstairs, while Dr. Harrison followed with his medical bag and the calm efficiency of long experience. The labor stretched through the night and into the following day, long and difficult in ways Dr. Harrison noted with concern, but not alarm. Caroline endured it in a haze of pain and morphine, dimly aware of the physician's examinations and the midwife's murmured encouragements, but mostly consumed by the physical ordeal of bringing a child into the world. Edward stationed himself outside the bedroom door, his presence a weight Caroline could feel even through walls and morphine fog. William paced the hallway, alternating between nervous energy and forced stillness, occasionally asking Dr. Harrison for updates that revealed little beyond the labor's slow progress. When the child finally emerged in the gray light of early morning, exhausted from the long struggle of birth, Dr. Harrison performed his customary examination with practiced hands. Caroline watched his face through her exhaustion, seeing his expression shift from routine professionalism to something more complex as he turned the infant to examine its back. His hands paused, and she knew with sinking certainty what he had found. The midwife, an elderly woman named Mrs. Brennan, who had delivered 3 generations of Hartwell babies, leaned in to look and went very still. Her eyes met Dr. Harrison's across the infant's small body, and some wordless communication passed between them. "A boy," Dr. Harrison announced, his voice carefully neutral. "Healthy and strong, breathing well. Mrs. Hartwell, you have a son." Caroline reached for the child with shaking arms, and as Dr. Harrison placed the infant against her chest, she saw over his tiny shoulder what they had seen. There on the left shoulder blade, dark red against pale newborn skin, was the unmistakable Hartwell birthmark. But the pattern was not William's neat bird shape. It was broader, more diffused, spreading irregular across the small shoulder in exactly the configuration that could only have come from one source. The room filled with heavy silence. Mrs. Brennan busied herself with cleaning up, her movements abrupt and her face carefully blank. Dr. Harrison recorded notes in his medical journal with slow deliberation, writing down what he had observed with the precision required of his profession. Neither looked directly at Caroline, but both understood what they had witnessed, what the child's skin had revealed about conception and paternity. "I will inform Mr. Hartwell," Dr. Harrison said quietly, closing his journal. "He will want to meet his son." Caroline clutched the baby tighter, knowing that the moment William saw the birthmark, everything would change. The truth she had tried desperately to hide had been written on her child's body from the instant of birth, permanent and undeniable, waiting only for someone to read what nature had documented about violence and violation and the cost of not being believed. William entered the room with Edward close behind him, both men eager to see the child. Caroline watched her husband's face as he approached the bed, saw his expression of pure joy and anticipation, and felt something break inside her chest, knowing what was about to destroy him. "A son," William breathed, reaching for the infant with gentle hands. "Let me hold him, Caroline. Let me see my boy." She released the baby reluctantly, watching as William cradled him with awkward tenderness, studying the small face with wonder. Edward moved closer, ostensibly to admire his nephew, but Caroline saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself to observe everything that happened next. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Hartwell, if I might direct your attention to the child's back. The family mark has appeared, as is customary." William shifted the baby carefully to examine his son's shoulder, his movements still gentle, despite growing confusion. Caroline watched understanding dawn slowly across his features, saw joy transform into bewilderment, and then into something darker as he turned the infant to better see the birthmark's distinctive pattern. He stood frozen for a long moment, his eyes moving from the baby's shoulder to Edward's face and back again. The room held its breath. Mrs. Brennan had stopped moving entirely, her hands still gripping soiled linens. Dr. Harrison stood with his medical bag, professional detachment cracking to show the discomfort of a man witnessing private tragedy. "This pattern," William said slowly, his voice strange and hollow. "This is not my mark." Edward stepped forward with his hand extended, as though to offer comfort or explanation, but William jerked away from him, clutching the baby tighter. "Do not touch me. Do not speak." He turned to Caroline then, and the look in his eyes made her want to disappear into the mattress beneath her. It was not quite accusation, not yet, but confusion and dawning horror, the expression of a man whose world was collapsing around foundations he had believed unshakable. "Caroline." Her name emerged barely above a whisper. "How is this possible?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. How could she explain months of predation, of warnings dismissed, of violence committed in darkness while he was away tending business? How could she make him understand that she had tried to tell him, tried to make him see, tried everything within her limited power to prevent exactly this? Edward found his voice before she could. "Brother, you must be mistaken. Birthmarks vary widely, and the child is barely an hour old. Surely you cannot be suggesting something so impossible, so monstrous." But William was not listening to Edward. He was staring at the baby's shoulder with the focused intensity of someone comparing it against 30 years of seeing his brother's bare back, of knowing every line and curve of a mark he had observed countless times in bathhouses and bedrooms during childhood swimming and adult hunting trips. The recognition was absolute and undeniable. He handed the baby to Mrs. Brennan with shaking hands, then turned on Edward with sudden violence. His fist connected with his brother's jaw before anyone could react, sending Edward stumbling backward into the washstand. The two men crashed together, years of brotherly affection transforming into rage and betrayal made physical. Dr. Harrison shouted for help, while Mrs. Brennan shielded the baby, and Caroline tried to rise from the bed despite her exhaustion and pain. Servants rushed in, pulling the brothers apart before real damage could be done beyond split lips and forming bruises. William fought against the hands restraining him, his face contorted with fury Caroline had never seen before. "How long?" he demanded, spitting blood. "How many times did you violate my wife while I was gone? While I trusted you with my home, my household, my family?" Edward wiped blood from his mouth, his mask of innocence finally slipping to reveal cold calculation beneath. "She wanted it, William. She came to me lonely and neglected, seeking comfort you failed to provide. The child is proof of her willingness, of mutual desire, not violation." The lie was so brazen, so perfectly calibrated to shift blame, that Caroline found her voice at last. "That is not true. He forced himself on me. I tried to tell you, tried to warn you about his intentions, but you would not listen. You called me hysterical. You defended him over me at every turn." William looked between them, his brother and his wife, his face showing the agony of a man torn between competing impossibilities. Everything Caroline had tried to tell him these past months came rushing back, all the warnings he had dismissed, all the concerns he had attributed to female hysteria or Southern unfamiliarity. The pattern was suddenly clear, but accepting it meant accepting his own culpability, his own failure to protect the woman he had promised to cherish. "Get out," he said to Edward, his voice breaking. "Get out of this house. Get off this property. I never want to see you again." Edward straightened his disheveled clothing, attempting dignity despite the blood on his face. "You are making a mistake, brother. When your anger cools, you will see that she has manipulated you, turned you against your own blood, with lies designed to excuse her own adultery. The child proves her guilt, not mine. The child proves exactly what happened," Dr. Harrison interjected quietly. "I have been delivering babies for 40 years, Mr. Hartwell, and I have seen things that never appear in medical journals. This mark tells a clear story to anyone willing to read it honestly. Your wife's distress, her condition these past months, the timeline of conception, all of it supports her account, not his." William turned away from all of them, his shoulders shaking. "Just go, Edward. Go now before I kill you." Edward left Hartwell Plantation that afternoon with nothing but the clothes he wore and a horse from the stables. He rode away without looking back, and Caroline watched from her bedroom window as he disappeared down the long drive, feeling no relief at his departure, only the hollow exhaustion of someone who had survived catastrophe but lost everything in the process. William did not come to her room that night, or the next. She could hear him in his study, the sound of furniture overturning and glass breaking, the muffled sounds of a man destroying things because he could not destroy the truth that had shattered his life. Dr. Harrison stayed on at the plantation for 3 more days, ostensibly to monitor Caroline's recovery, but actually serving as buffer between husband and wife, both of whom seemed incapable of facing each other directly. On the fourth day, William finally entered her room. He looked 10 years older, his face haggard, and his eyes red from sleeplessness or weeping or both. He stood at the foot of her bed, not coming closer, his hands gripping the bedpost as though needing its support. "Tell me everything," he said. "No euphemisms, no attempts to spare my feelings. I need to know exactly what happened and when." So Caroline told him. She described Edward's initial attention that she had tried to dismiss as brotherly kindness, the escalating comments and touches that crossed boundaries she could not quite name. She recounted the library encounter, where Edward had made his intentions explicit, the greenhouse confrontation where he had detailed his obsession. She spoke of the night he came to her locked room with a key, of her screams that no servant acknowledged hearing, of the violation itself and Edward's threats afterward. William listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively more ashen. When she finished, silence stretched between them like an ocean neither knew how to cross. "I tried to tell you," Caroline said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Multiple times. But you thought I was being hysterical, imagining things because I was unaccustomed to Virginia ways. You chose to believe him over me at every turn." "I know." The words came out broken. "God help me. I know. You warned me and I dismissed you. You told me something was wrong and I accused you of trying to damage my relationship with my brother. I enabled everything that happened to you because I could not imagine Edward capable of such betrayal." He sank into the chair beside her bed, his head in his hands. "I do not know how to bear this. My brother violated my wife. My son is not my son. Every foundation I built my life upon has revealed itself to be sand." Caroline felt a flicker of anger cut through her exhaustion. "The child is innocent of how he was conceived. He did not choose his father or the circumstances of his creation. Whatever you decide about us, about this marriage, he deserves better than to be treated as a living reminder of betrayal." "I cannot look at him without seeing Edward's face in his features," William admitted. "I cannot hold him without feeling rage at what he represents. I know that is unjust. I know he bears no guilt for the sins that created him. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it are different matters entirely." Mrs. Brennan had been caring for the infant in the nursery, bringing him to Caroline for feeding, but otherwise keeping him separated from the chaos consuming the household. The baby thrived despite the circumstances of his birth, healthy and strong, unaware that his existence had destroyed a family. "What will you do?" Caroline asked. "Will you send me back to Charleston in disgrace? Claim the child is stillborn and hide me away, somewhere? There are only so many options available, and none of them repair what has been broken." William was silent for a long time. "I do not know. Part of me wants to annul this marriage and erase every trace of what happened. But doing so would expose you to scandal and condemnation, would mark the child as illegitimate, would broadcast our family's shame to all of Virginia society. Another part of me recognizes that you are as much a victim in this as I am, that you tried to warn me and I failed to protect you." He stood abruptly, unable to remain still. "I need time to think, to decide what can be salvaged from this wreckage. Dr. Harrison has agreed to record the birth as legitimate, to note nothing unusual in his official report. That gives us space to determine what happens next without immediate public scandal forcing our hand." "And Edward?" Caroline asked. "Will you pursue legal charges? Bring this before authorities?" William's laugh was bitter. and admit to the world that my brother raped my wife and fathered my supposed heir? Watch our family name dragged through courts and newspapers while lawyers debate the details of your violation for public entertainment? No, Edward is gone, and that will have to be enough. Anything more destroys us all." He moved toward the door, then paused without turning back. "I do not blame you for what happened, Caroline. I blame myself for not listening when you tried to tell me the truth. But I do not know if I can forgive myself enough to rebuild what we had before. I do not know if that is even possible." The door closed behind him, and Caroline was alone again with the weight of everything that could not be undone, could not be fixed, could only be endured, and somehow survived. The marriage continued in form, but died in everything that mattered. William moved to separate quarters in another wing of the house, maintaining appearances for the servants and occasional visitors, but unable to share a bed with a wife whose body reminded him of his brother's betrayal. He was not cruel, but neither was he present, treating Caroline with the distant politeness one might show a house guest rather than a spouse. The child, whom they named Thomas after William's grandfather in a gesture toward maintaining family legitimacy, became the focus of Caroline's entire existence. She poured into him all the love and attention that had nowhere else to go, nursing him herself, despite William's suggestion that they hire a wet nurse, refusing to be separated from the one innocent thing to emerge from the wreckage of her life. Thomas grew quickly, a healthy infant who smiled early and reached for his mother with eager hands. But as the months passed, his features began to resolve into something that made William's rare visits to the nursery grow even more infrequent. The baby's face held nothing of William's strong Hartwell features, and everything of Edward's sharper angles and darker coloring. The resemblance was unmistakable to anyone who had known both brothers, a living reminder that would grow more pronounced with each passing year. Servants whispered, of course. Mrs. Brennan had been discreet, but other household staff noticed the separate bedrooms, the careful distance William maintained from both wife and child, the way he flinched when Thomas cried in another room. The neighboring Plantation families noticed too, though Virginia politeness prevented direct questions. Invitations to social gatherings grew less frequent, and when Caroline did attend with William, conversations would pause and resume in carefully neutral topics that avoided any mention of the baby or family matters. Caroline began writing letters to her sister Louisa in Charleston, careful detailed accounts of everything that had happened from the moment she arrived at Hartwell Plantation to the present day. She kept copies of each letter in a locked box in her room, creating a documented record of Edward's predation, William's dismissal of her warnings, the assault itself, and the aftermath. If nothing else, she thought, someday someone might read these pages and understand that she had tried, that she had spoken truth and been ignored, that the child was proof of violation rather than willing adultery. In one letter dated September 1853, preserved among family papers that would not surface until decades later, Caroline wrote with devastating clarity about the isolation of her position. She described how women in her situation had no legal recourse, how a wife's testimony against her husband's family carried no weight in Virginia courts, how the very evidence that should have proven her innocence instead marked her as permanently compromised. The letter concluded with a paragraph that would be quoted by historians studying the legal limitations faced by women in the antebellum South. William's business suffered under the weight of his distraction and grief. He made poor decisions about crop rotations and market timing, lost money on investments he would normally have researched thoroughly, alienated business partners with his increasingly erratic behavior. The plantation that had thrived under his and Edward's joint management began showing signs of decline, fields going unattended, and profits shrinking, as William proved unable to manage alone what two brothers had previously handled together. By winter, William's drinking had become noticeable. He spent long hours in his study with bourbon for company, emerging only for meals that he barely touched while sitting in silence at the opposite end of the table from Caroline. When he did speak to her, it was only about household necessities, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes always sliding away from direct contact, unable to meet her gaze without seeing Edward's violation reflected back at him. Thomas learned to crawl, then to pull himself upright on furniture, developing with the normal milestones that should have brought joy to new parents, but instead only deepened the chasm between husband and wife. Caroline documented each achievement in letters to her sister, creating a record of her son's growth that also served as testimony to the love she poured into a child the world viewed with suspicion, and his supposed father could barely acknowledge. The household staff grew increasingly uncomfortable with the tension saturating every room. 2 maids requested transfers to other properties, and the butler who had served the Hartwell family for 20 years gave notice, citing health concerns, but really fleeing an atmosphere that had become unbearable. Those who remained did their work with quiet efficiency, but avoided both William and Caroline whenever possible, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of a marriage that everyone knew had become a polite fiction, maintained only to avoid greater scandal. Caroline understood that she was effectively imprisoned, not by walls, but by circumstance and social convention. Divorce was nearly impossible for women and would mark her as ruined. Separation would leave her penniless and dependent on family charity. Staying meant enduring a life of isolation and blame for violence committed against her. But at least it provided shelter for Thomas and a chance that someday, somehow, the truth might matter more than reputation. William Hartwell died in 1861, thrown from a horse during a morning ride that neighbors suspected was less accident than a man's final surrender to unbearable circumstances. He left the plantation to Thomas in his will, acknowledging the boy as his legal heir despite the birthmark that told a different story, perhaps finding in death the grace he could not manage in life. Caroline remained at Hartwell Plantation for another 30 years, raising Thomas alone while managing an estate that struggled under the weight of war and Reconstruction. The child grew into a young man who bore Edward's features so completely that Caroline sometimes had to look away, though she never stopped loving him or treating him with anything less than complete devotion. He never learned the full truth of his conception, knowing only that his uncle Edward had left under unclear circumstances before he was born, and that his father had been a distant, troubled man. Thomas married at 25, choosing a kind woman from a neighboring county who asked no questions about family history or the strange isolation of Hartwell Plantation. They had 3 children who bore the Hartwell birthmark in various patterns, and Caroline took comfort in watching her grandchildren grow up innocent of the violence that had brought their father into the world. She died in 1884 at the age of 54, worn down by decades of carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. Among her effects, her daughter-in-law found the locked box of letters documenting everything that had happened in 1852 and 53. The letters were read, discussed quietly among family members who had long suspected something terrible lay behind the household's strange dynamics, then locked away again for another generation to discover. Edward Hartwell was never seen in Virginia again after his expulsion from the plantation. Rumors surfaced periodically, placing him in Tennessee, then Texas, then California, always moving west, away from the consequences of his actions. Whether he ever married, had other children, or lived long enough to regret what he had done, remained unknown to the family he had destroyed. The story became one of those family secrets passed down through whispers and incomplete explanations, with each generation understanding slightly less than the one before. By the early 20th century, most Hartwell descendants knew only that great-grandfather William and his brother Edward had experienced a falling out over unspecified matters, and that great-grandmother Caroline had been a sad, isolated woman who wrote extensive letters that were never mailed. In 1937, a historian researching antebellum Virginia plantation life discovered Caroline's letters in the Hartwell family archives and recognized their significance. Her documentation of assault, of warnings ignored, of a legal system that provided no recourse for violated wives, became part of academic discussions about women's experiences in the antebellum South. The birthmark that had revealed the truth became a footnote in historical analysis of how biological evidence could expose lies but could not guarantee justice or healing. Thomas's descendants still live on portions of what was once Hartwell Plantation, though the great house burned in 1912 and was never rebuilt. Some of them carry the distinctive birthmark, variations on patterns that trace back through generations to brothers whose bond was destroyed by violence and betrayal. They know the story now, or at least the version that has survived in family memory and historical records, understanding that Caroline tried to speak and was not believed until her child's body spoke for her. The tale became a cautionary reminder about the cost of dismissing women's warnings, about how power imbalances can trap victims in silence, about how sometimes truth writes itself on innocent skin when it cannot be spoken aloud. Caroline's letters remain in the Virginia Historical Society archives, available to researchers studying the legal and social constraints faced by women who experienced violence within families, where loyalty and reputation mattered more than justice or protection. In the end, what happened at Hartwell Plantation in 1852 proved neither unique nor particularly unusual for its time, just unusually well documented by a woman who understood that silence served only those who benefited from it. Her son grew up healthy and loved despite the circumstances of his conception, carrying a mark that told a truth. His mother had tried desperately to speak long before his birth, made it visible to eyes finally willing to see. If this story has made you think about how many voices throughout history tried to warn others and were dismissed as hysterical or unreliable, then honor Caroline's courage by clicking that like button and subscribing to this channel. Share this story with others who need to understand that speaking truth has always required bravery, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply believe someone when they tell us they are in danger.